In this section, which is in the finance section, we're going to deal with a topic referred to as buyer qualification. Now, in buyer qualification, this is what the bank is looking at to determine how much a buyer can qualify for. Now, it's a buyer to you as the agent. It would be a borrower to the lender. But there's a little math question here that has a little bit of complexity to it. But if we take and put it into the T-bar, you'll actually find that this is not a terribly difficult problem. But buyer qualification is going to fall into two categories. One will be minimum income, meaning how much money must someone make to qualify for a particular payment. And then the other one will be maximum loan or maximum payment amount, which we'll talk about based on their income, how much can they afford in a monthly payment. So when we take a look at this, here's what we're going to look at. We're going to put it in a T-bar, and some of you may or may not use the T-bar, but on this problem, from an organizational standpoint, I highly recommend the T-bar. And in the T-bar, we're actually going to have two. The first one, what I call the front-end ratio, is going to be based on the buyer's housing expense in relationship to his gross monthly income. That's what these things stand for. And then the ratio. I'll give you those ratios in just a moment. But for our purposes, the bank has ratios which they will apply to the buyer. Now, notice at the back end here, it's kind of like Sesame Street. It's what's the same and what's different. When you look at the top, you still see housing expense. When you look at the bottom, you still see gross monthly income and ratio. But notice that on the back end, what I call the back end down here, we also have LTD. I refer to that as long-term debt. Sometimes you may see it as recurring debt or sometimes just other debt. So notice that when the bank's qualifying you, what the bank does is they look at two perspectives. This first perspective here is going to be based on what's the relationship of your housing expense to your gross monthly income, which makes a lot of sense. Matter of fact, even if you rent apartments, oftentimes they will apply a similar ratio to that. But banks are not stupid, so they also have this back-end ratio, which says, well, not only your housing expense, but all your debt. How does that apply to your gross monthly income? So let's play with some numbers on this just to give you an idea of what this would look like. Now, let me remind you, HE stands for housing expense. Now, housing expense is going to include PI and TI. Remember that? Principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. And if there is any, it would also include private mortgage insurance and HOA. Now, sometimes the problems don't go that much into detail, but having said that, your housing expense, the way I describe it in class, oftentimes is just simply saying that's what you'd have to pay, even if you never turn on the electrical or anything like that. So PITI plus PMI, HOA, everything's paid on a monthly basis in regards to the house. So let's give a problem here, and let's say that this is someone who makes maybe $5,000 $5,000 a month, $60,000 per year. And in the problems, they may either give you the monthly or they may give you the annual, and you just have to take it back to a month, because notice that the problem is set up gross monthly income. So let's say this person makes $5,000 per month. Okay. Now, the bank ratios we will typically give you, and they'll typically be something like 28% and 36%. We're going to deal with the 28 to start with on this front end. So basically, you say, well, what do I learn here? Well, remember on the T-bar, what you learned is that if you take the monthly income and multiply it by the ratio, if you multiply the two bottom numbers, it will give you the top number. So basically, what did I just find by saying that his income of 5,000 times 28%? Basically, it told me what his maximum housing expense could be, his maximum PITI could be in this particular case. If they run the numbers and his payment's only going to be $1,200, he's golden, because that's going to be fantastic. But remember, banks are not crazy. So what they will do is they will take a look at what your back end situation could be as well. So in this particular case, let's say that he still has the same monthly income, but in the back end, we give a higher ratio. Well, why do we give a higher ratio? It actually is because that includes all your debt, your other, what we call long-term debt, like your student loan payments, your car payments, your credit cards that you don't pay off on a regular basis, your second mortgage loans, or things like that. Let's say in this particular case that this person has $600 a month in long-term debt. Maybe it sounds to me like a car payment and a student loan payment. So down here, if we were looking for the housing expense, we would have something that ultimately looks like this. I will tell you that students often get this next step confused a little bit, and I'll show you why. If you multiply 5,000 times 36%, what you actually get is $1,800. But you have to be careful down here on the back end because 1,800 includes not only housing expense plus long-term debt. Well, if this problem is asking you what the housing expense, what the maximum housing expense he can afford is, then what you have to do is you have to isolate this variable right here. So you'll end up with something that looks like this. You'll end up with something that says housing expense plus 600 because everything above the T-bar equals everything below the T-bar. And then I don't like to use the word algebra in class, but you probably learned this at some point in your schooling that to isolate the housing expense variable, what I need to do is get rid of everything else on that side. And if I subtract the number from this side, I have to do the same thing on this side. And so at the end of the day, the housing expense down here, I'm sorry, 600 is what I was subtracting out, is going to be 1,200. Now, there's one more trick to this problem. This problem that you're looking at right here is a question of what is the maximum housing expense allowed? And you just came up with two different numbers. Based on his income, the housing expense could be 1,400, but based on his debt, his total debt, his payment can only be $1,200. Well, you may know this about banks, and banks are notoriously conservative. And so when in doubt, when you're asking a question about the maximum loan amount or the maximum monthly payment, the answer is always going to be the lesser of the two. I would love it if that made sense to you logically, that the banks are always going to take the most conservative position. However, if you don't understand it logically, just always remember maximum housing expense is going to be the lower of the two. In just a moment, we're also going to do a problem that looks at this from a different angle. So this problem that you just looked at here is what I would refer to as a maximum housing expense problem. Okay. Oops, let me get that over in the picture a little bit. A maximum housing expense problem.